is Greg Madison, and this is the first episode of The Living Process, a series of conversations with focusing people in a focusing style. My first guest is Siebrecht Vanhooren. Siebrecht is a clinical psychologist and a professor of clinical psychology at Leuven University in Belgium. He's well known in the focusing community and was the first recipient of the Gendlin Research Grant in order to support his work on looking at the therapeutic process and the process of therapists during therapy, which is something we speak about in this episode. He is co-director of the Meaning and Existence Center at the university. And we talk a little bit about his clinical background, working with prisoners. We talk about the combination of the existential and experiential traditions, which is something that we both share, and what focusing adds to existential therapy and what the existential tradition can add to focusing. And we go into that a little bit more when Siebrecht is talking about sort of the more darker aspects of human existence and how in the focusing world we might have a tendency to shy away from those. And he's wanting to bring those back in. We also talk a little bit about spirituality and how Gendlin shied away from that, and also some of the principles of working as a focusing-oriented therapist. I hope you enjoy the episode. I found it very interesting, and here is my conversation with Siebrecht Vanhooren. Welcome, Siebrecht.
Good morning, Greg.
Yeah, nice to see you. I'm aware that it was just a few days ago that the Gendlin Symposium was aired and that you were a part of that.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, a few days later now, how that's sitting with you, what the experience was like, if there's anything kind of still bubbling away from that.
Yes, actually, first and for all, it was a very nice and good experience. So I was talking about our experiential existential approach, which is a kind of a focusing existential approach, and you have a lot to do with that, of course. So, and what I was trying to explain was a little bit about how Gendlin was not very explicit about certain existential topics, and it has its history why. What I really enjoyed also afterwards, that, you know, making space for darker subjects such as death and the fact that probably part of a process is always that we are stuck somewhere and that we can feel very lonely and there is a lot of meaninglessness. It kind of opened a space, I think, for people to talk about, to think about, and it was maybe even a little bit liberating. I don't know, but that has stayed with me from the conference, from the Gendlin conference, and from reactions I actually got from people.
Yeah, terrific.
Yes, yeah.
I would agree. Certainly my experience of the focusing world is that those kinds of topics don't often come up. I'm curious, why do you think that is, or why do you think Gendlin didn't give more attention to that?
Yeah, I think I don't know. We should ask him. I think you did probably in the past,
Yes.
right? But what I think is interesting, I actually never met Eugene Gendlin, like person to person. I was on occasions that it was expected that he would be there too, but he was sick or he couldn't come or canceled at the last moment. But I tried to read a lot of his writings, watch a lot of his videos. And when I read like stuff he has been written in the 70s, he seems to distance himself from existential psychology, at least, and existential psychotherapy in some of his papers, because I think that's true. I think that's kind of something in that existential psychotherapy world, that it can become very conceptual.
Yes.
And as if, there's a lot of theory, and actually it's not always helpful. Like, it leads people away from their lived experience of their existence. And I think what Gendlin did was creating a different avenue to experience existence in therapy or just in a focusing partnership. And his theory is very phenomenological. So he's actually starting from the lived experience. And because of that, maybe, along the way, he stepped away from certain topics, or he was less explicit about it, because maybe it would be in the way of how people experience it themselves.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my hypothesis, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I remember, I think that Gendlin would have said that when existential therapy is successful in some way, it is experiential,
Yes.
rather than philosophical or cognitive. I remember having a conversation with him because you and I share this unusual integration of existential, although why it's unusual is an interesting question, because they're also very compatible, the existential and the experiential. And I would often have conversations with Jean about the darker side of things. And we would argue, and then wondering if we're actually both on the same side. Because I would say, well, he would start by saying it wouldn't be so tragic if it wasn't also beautiful. And I would say, well, it wouldn't be so beautiful if it wasn't also tragic.
Right. Yes.
And then he would talk about optimism. I would talk about pessimism. And we ended up me talking about exhilarating pessimism, a kind of pessimism that is life affirming. And he would talk about not pink optimism, a kind of optimism that isn't just some phony positivity. And so I wonder if maybe the sort of things we're bringing together, they actually fit together, but the language is very different.
Yes. I think the language might be different. And maybe a little bit the optimistic, pessimistic point of view. I don't know, the starting point. No, I myself, I'm really an optimist.
Yeah.
So, and also we don't need to divide it into those two categories, right?
Exactly.
But yes, maybe it also depends on the stage in your life or the place where you're in. I don't know. I think also Gendlin, that would not be correct. I almost said worked in the slipstream of Rogers, but that's not correct. But there was in the 60s, 70s, a lot of optimism also, and like freedom and discovering. I don't know. I think the whole humanistic movement has a very optimistic approach. And maybe that's also why it's a little bit skewed to the optimism, like the living forward process is like something that always leads to a positive outcome. But actually, I'm not sure about that.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, or a focusing process always leads to a felt shift, or to like kind of something that is rounded, or but I'm also not sure about that. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Lately, or in the last years, I started diving into the little bit the literature of Otto Rank and of Jesse Taft, and they're actually coming from the psychoanalytic world. Like Rank was one of the colleagues, pupils of Sigmund Freud, so very close to that first psychoanalytic cycle And what is actually interesting to notice is that Rank emphasizes death and life, and the growth process is a painful process, according to Jesse Taft. So there is like kind of equal emphasis on like the light and the dark, or the pain and the beauty. And maybe somehow in the development of the humanistic approach, I think focusing is pretty much in that, within that big container or under that big umbrella, there became a shift towards more emphasis on the positive side. Anyway, so I didn't mention that, but like Rogers was really, really strongly influenced by Otto Rank's writings and by Jesse Taft. And actually in the 70s, we see Gendlin also referring to Otto Rank, because Rank is talking about experiencing the therapeutic process and some other things. Yeah.
That's interesting. It's a big topic, but a very fascinating one, this sort of optimism or positivity. I'm wondering, it makes me wonder if you have any thoughts about why focusing or Gendlin's work or this experiencing, carrying forward process hasn't made more kind of an explicit impact in the world of therapy.
Well, maybe it has something to do with that. I don't know. But maybe it's because I'm just making some associations. But it's not. I think therapy is also a lot about pain and a lot about openness towards the darkness and to what we are ashamed about or shamed for, and very dark feelings, a lot of pain. I don't know. And it seems like when you sometimes it feels, and not with everyone, of course, etc. But in the focusing community, it's a lot about feeling good or going to a good place.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. But I feel like maybe I'm making now a caricature of our focusing community.
Well, there is something in the community, in my experience, that is a little bit like what you're describing. There is an I don't know if it's an expectation, or maybe it's even a little more than that. Kind of that if you're doing focusing well, it takes you to a positive, better place. And if you're not finding that better place, then somehow you're doing it wrong.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Like you made or you don't know how to focus.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But I think maybe this is partly the point you're making, is if we acknowledge the much more difficult aspects of life, things that we have maybe been hiding from ourselves, not wanting to admit, it's not that it's something that we are glad is true, but there is something in the facing the reality that is a relief. It can feel good to finally admit, I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed I did that. There can be a bodily release that actually feels life affirming, even though the content sounds depressing or difficult or negative.
Yes. Yes. I think that's the point where feeling good or not feeling good like disappears.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because then we're not talking about like what is a good outcome or whatever.
Yeah.
It's an openness towards our humanity.
Yeah.
And to the ambivalence of life.
Yes.
I think. And all the ambivalent feelings, which actually, I think, create a very different way of maybe experiencing life. It broadens, I think, our scope.
Yeah.
And the problems we are facing.
It's more inclusive in some way. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So how did you end up in this world? What brought you into the
So great.
focusing world? Were you a therapist already and looking for something else, or?
Actually, I was very lucky. I was a student. When I started studying psychology, we had a professor called Rick Willemars. He was in Ghent, not in Leuven University. And he was broadly interested in all kinds of experiential therapies. So he was teaching person-centered, Gestalt, existential therapies. So very, very broadly, actually, and focusing. And we had like a lot of classes, experiential therapy, I think 4 hours a week theory, and then like was like really a lot, and then 4 hours of practicums every week, I think during 2 years. And this is actually where I learned about focusing. So I was 21, 22, and I had like a kind of a natural click, so to speak, with the work of Gendlin and of also with Rogers. At that time, I thought the existential stuff was pretty, even maybe a little bit alienating because of the theory, and it just like fit, I think, with who I was at that time and who I still am. And so I have the feeling that my quest or my to find focusing was not a hard one, like was almost on a serving plate, so to speak. And after that, then I studied to become a therapist, and it was a training like here, typically in Belgium, we tend to integrate different kinds of person-centered therapies. So there was like classical person-centered therapy, but there was also a lot of experiential stuff in our training. So a lot of focusing with Claude Missial, right? And we had like also some EFT, emotion focused therapy, although probably it didn't was not called EFT yet at that time. And also a little bit of existential therapy. So for me, it always came together, the focusing, but also the other approaches, experiential approaches. And I think just in my life and also as a kid, I think for me, the existential layer of life has always been there. As a kid, I could say that I experienced a lot of death anxiety. I like really had a lot of nightmares. There was like always a sense that I would die as a kid. I also had some like problems with breathing, so probably that was not or that fed into that experience of vulnerability. So for me, it has like been a kind of logical that those things fit together, that they go together. Yes. So, yeah.
So that's interesting. I mean, I hadn't realized to what extent our way into the focusing world was so similar.
Okay.
My way in is kind of similar. Like you, I just had the good fortune of landing in a university place where focusing was a tiny part of what was on offer. And I think, like you, there was already something in me that was waiting for it or looking for it, or that immediately resonated with it. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Yes, and resonating is a good word because it's like kind of recognized
Yes.
the theory or recognized the way of working, like it was kind of a natural fit, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do you, in addition to your work at the university, which I'd like to ask a little bit more about, but in addition to that, are you seeing clients or do you have time for that?
Yes, actually, I have to think and count. I think for 15 years, I had been practicing as a therapist in different settings before I arrived here at the university to do my PhD. So I worked with prisoners, the therapy with prisoners, with also victims of violence, like a trauma center. I worked in mental health centers, like different settings, just because I was curious to taste from different settings.
Yeah.
And I was a therapist, and I was seeing a lot and lots of clients, and I kept on reading and studying a little bit also by myself and doing a little bit of research. So I think for most of my professional career, I have been working as a therapist. And now I'm still seeing clients because I think there is a real risk when you're a professor, when you're teaching, and you're not seeing the clients, or when you're a researcher and you're not working with clients, that maybe at a certain point you end up in an ivory tower.
Yeah.
And you don't know, or you don't have like a test, or you're not, yeah, probably you understand what I mean. Like
Yes.
there is no check anymore, like a reality check. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
totally agree.
Yeah.
So that earlier work you were involved in, those are very intense kind of settings.
Yes.
I'm curious to know, were you able to integrate focusing or sort of felt sensing into that work, or what was that like?
Yes, a lot actually. And I remember when we started, or when I started to do therapy, like from a more humanistic, person-centered, experiential point of view with prisoners and with offenders, there was not a lot around, So it was just me, I think, and my colleague Ellen Gunst. We were like trying to figure it out how to work experientially with these people. And actually, I did my PhD around working with prisoners from this point of view. So, and it was very interesting, and I think focusing helped me and helped my clients a lot. Also, not to get stuck in that trap where you think that you need to find the truth, so to speak, right? But like to be there with that process, and with positive regard, be present with those people, like with victims, but also with offenders.
Yeah.
Because the stories, surprisingly or not, were not that different. And I worked especially with people who had like committed very like intense crimes, like murder, and with like towards partners, towards their children. So it was a lot of heavy and existential stuff.
Yeah.
And the existential themes or issues were just there. Like when you commit a serious crime, there is that question, like, do I still have the right to live or to go on? Or how do I live with the fact that I'm guilty? Yeah.
That sounds, yeah, incredible work. And this may just be a stereotype that I carry, but I'm thinking of some of the people that you met in prisons might not have been used to or open to getting in touch with feelings. I'm thinking there's a whole stereotype of kind of the strong, kind of macho man sort of thing, but you didn't run into that?
Oh, you run constantly into that.
Okay.
I mean, I also worked with women in prison, female prisoners.
Okay.
But with the male guys, they all look like John Wayne in the hallway. They walk like and they come in your office and they sit down, and suddenly there is a lot of vulnerability. There is when people feel safe,
Yeah.
there is a shift, and they know why they are coming. Also, I think our setting was pretty transparent. We were not reporting to the prison guards or to the prison system at all, because we were a mental health service coming from outside the wall, so to speak. So they kind of knew that they actually had nothing to gain by coming into therapy. We didn't write any reports. So people who came because they wanted to.
Yeah.
So, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference. And it's interesting that the shift you describe in in their manner when they come into the office. It reminds me of Gendlin talking about the therapeutic relationship was the difference it made in his body, that just he's there with his therapist in his therapist's room, and something about that interaction already
Yes.
prepared him
Yes.
to be more vulnerable.
Yes. Like from the moment they opened the door and
Yeah,
you
yeah,
saw them almost like shrinking into little boys in
yeah,
that chair.
yeah.
And the opposite also, because prison is not a safe place to be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So they kind of have to gear up
mm-hmm. Yeah,
again to
yeah,
go back into the hallway and
yeah.
be that tough guy. So yeah,
Yeah, it's so interesting that that threshold between the office and the hallway and what happens there.
what happens there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about interaction first and
Mm.
environments and etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Can I, how do you now, I do want to get back to your work at the university a bit, but just bringing in the philosophy as you have, how do you understand, and I'm asking this just because in the FOT world, it's a lot of people now refer to interaction first. And I'm wondering, how do you understand that in terms of therapy? Like how does it show up, maybe I could say, in
Like
the,
really like concrete.
yeah, quite concretely.
I think it shows up in the fact that as a therapist, I'm also different with my client because the client also, I'm the environment of the client, but the client is also my environment.
Yes. Yeah.
So we are both each other's environment. And um, I think that's why it's not a one, how do you say that? The English term doesn't come, but it's not a one-way
Hmm.
direction.
Yeah. It's
And I think
mutual.
it's mutual. I think I feel it especially, of course, when I kind of sense the felt sense of the client, which is also right, which is
Hmm.
might be also mine at the same point. I think it's not always
Hmm.
clear whose is what.
Hmm.
And also when there is something when there is a rupture in the therapeutic alliance, because you sense it, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's not just the alliance or it's not just the client, but it's also painful for yourself as a therapist to notice that something is happening in this relationship that is not going so well, or your client is taking distance, or, I think that's very, very noticeable.
Yes.
And other things that are noticeable is just being there in that room together on a very, very basic level. There is, yeah.
And would you share some of that? Would you share some of the bodily responses that are happening in you, or?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
For me, that's also my, I think actually like empathy starts from there,
Hmm.
from what you sense,
Hmm.
and what you sense in this relationship and what you catch or what you don't catch. I think it's, Gendlin also calls it crossing. I think, the line between crossing and empathy is not always clear. Of course,
Hmm.
these are also just concepts. Um, but yes, yes, I would. Of course, if I think it's helpful to the client, or
Hmm.
sometimes I say like, yeah, I feel something could be mine. I don't know. Do you recognize this? So you kind of stuff
Hmm.
with your clients. But I think it's really physically there. Like it's an
Yes.
therapy is an embodied experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and would you make any distinction between what you're just talking about and the concepts? I know there's different versions of this, but any of the concepts of transference, countertransference, or would you say that's just a different language for the same thing? Or
There sometimes yes and sometimes no.
okay.
It also depends how you understand transference and contra-transference.
Yeah.
It's maybe it has something to do with what Gendlin called our structure-bound experiences, how they also part of this interactional process, and patterns of how we are with other people or with experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, that if you, as the therapist, if you explore what's happening in you while you're with the client, you have some insight into the client's more general way of being.
Yes, and
As
your own
well as
way of being.
exactly. Yeah.
At the same time, and
Exactly.
how those meet, or
Yeah.
how they are alive at this very moment in this relationship, or in this being together.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. And yeah. So that does make me curious about the kind of work that you've been doing at the university. What sort of projects? I mean, I've heard some of your students talking about very exciting things they're doing in their own research. Could you tell us something about what's happening there?
There's a lot happening.
Yeah,
but
good.
Research-wise, what we are trying to do is thinking through different projects is actually to gain some clarity about what therapists are actually experiencing in therapy, and especially when those like what we call existential concerns come up during therapy, when clients speak about it, or when there is like a clear existential situation, such as group therapy with cancer patients or with prisoners. And I think this is like the starting point, like what do therapists experience actually? How do they respond, or how do they not respond, or what happens? And we have like some very interesting studies running, and they all point at the fact that it's not easy for therapists when clients bring really like those existential characteristics of their living process, such as meaninglessness, or like finiteness, or like real like deep existential isolation, because that's the interaction first.
Yes.
You cannot, as other human being, or at least with two human beings in the same room, and what the client is talking about actually is also a lot about yourself, because you're also dying at some point, and you're also often feel maybe misunderstood or not completely understood, or you feel isolated maybe and there's probably also a lot of meaninglessness in your life, and that's also a challenge. And we see that many therapists, like, they give different reactions, but they often retreat or close, or do things in order not to be with those moments in therapy, with those existential moments.
Yeah, I would entirely agree with you. I mean, even in my own practice, depends on the client, depends on my relationship with the client, but certainly some of those issues at this point in my life, at this age, I can feel in me that it touches a shakiness. And then I have a choice. Do I take a step into that and share it and make it a shared exploration that we both are living with? Or do I take a step back and interpret the client, or make them focus, or do something that keeps them away from me?
Yes. And that's exactly what we are seeing. And that's also what I recognize myself as a therapist, right? Because it's like there is that moment of choice. Or, I mean, when you're aware of it. Right? It's like, okay, this is close, or wow, there's so much meaninglessness. How on earth will we get out of this? Maybe not, and that anxiety around it, or feeling overwhelmed by it. And so it seems like, I mean, that's what I recognize, what you recognize, that therapists do a lot of work, or they try to do something. in order
Mhm.
maybe to regulate their own experiences, which is, of course, we think is not very helpful. And actually was, I think, Gendlin who was talking about this, like, at least you try to be there with your client and don't use focusing as an instrument to
Yeah.
go away from your clients or from those topics. And also Rogers was talking about those things. And maybe I don't know, maybe because we became better and better in doing things, also experientially, like there's a lot of experiential methods to use these days.
Mm.
I sometimes wonder if that's sometimes a way of experiential avoidance almost. Of course, I myself, I do a lot of focusing. I also learned a lot from emotion focus therapy. I use chair work now and then when I think it's interesting, like empty chair work, because sometimes we don't need to talk about that, but it's sometimes easier almost for a client to do that in a different chair.
Yeah.
But of course, why do you use it? Like, do you use it as because you feel like this will help us to get closer or to be with what's happening, or do we use it in order to do something because I
Yeah.
feel panic?
Why are you using it in that particular
Yes,
moment?
yes, exactly. Yeah.
And why do you think it is that there's this tendency in therapy? I mean, certainly there's been theoretical reasons for it in the past, but even now, and certainly this also exists in the focusing oriented world, we aren't maybe that different. Um, why do you think it is that in our work, when those moments are touched that are shared, um, what are we afraid of?
Good
Like,
question.
why don't we open up and just sort of say, "Oh yeah, God, I know exactly what you're talking about. I can really
Right.
feel it."
I think probably there's so many reasons. There's so many reasons. There is a lot of personal vulnerability, I think. So
Mhm.
it maybe also depends on the therapeutic relationship. That could be a possibility. But it's also, I think for many therapists, that's what they say. It's like very overwhelming and they feel like suddenly there are existential questions they didn't expect there to be. And they
Mhm.
have to, they really have to think about those existential themes, and maybe they don't want to. Um,
Mhm.
maybe also, I think there is also a shift in relationship. You're not that maybe you're more a human being or a fellow traveler than like a specialist expert therapist who will solve the problem, so to speak. Um, yeah,
So part of the overwhelm is
I
how
think
they
so.
think they should be as a therapist.
Yes, yes. Yeah. What do you think, Greg? What are your thoughts?
Um, I think I guess the thought that was going through my mind as I was listening to you is would we feel as overwhelmed if we were talking to a friend about that?
Right,
Someone where it was a much more mutual relationship, it's not a professional relationship.
right.
So is part of the overwhelm our trying to maintain some kind of a professional stance the way we interpret it, and we're worried that if we share and are too mutual, that what are they paying us for then?
Yes. What that reminds me that a lot of therapists, and I think also myself at some points, feel powerless.
Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe that is a little bit aligned to what you're saying, like you're supposed to be the person who is helpful, and you feel like you cannot be of help, or you cannot solve
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
client's existential fear or their loneliness or the fact that they will die,
Mm-hmm.
or um, and that you will die too, you know and yeah, it's can feel really overwhelming. It can really feel powerless, and that might feel a hard thing as a therapist. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember in conversations with Gendlin, when we would talk about these things, we would notice how in the talking about it, we are already evoking it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm feeling that a little bit now, that I'm on the edge of feeling the reality of what you're saying, rather than it just being a discussion. It's like, oh my
Right.
God, this is actually real.
This is real. This is real. You know what I recently, or maybe it's a year ago, you know what's recent, I reread the Rogers Buber dialogue or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like the latest translation, because there were, in the former translation, there was like they did something wrong anyway.
Okay.
And Rogers is pointing out that actually the like empathy and authenticity, etc., is actually only a help to come to those moments that we have those existential meetings with our clients. And for Rogers, he says that's is actually the moment of change, so to speak. So I think that's really interesting, because Rogers is always, portrayed as a guy with, about empathy and about congruence and positive regard. But he says, well, it's actually only a stepping stone towards those moments of deep meeting.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, that's what we sense, right? When we are not only talking about it anymore, but also experience it. And I think as a therapist, it gets really close. It's really different to also be in the here and now with the client's past, or with the client's issues with their spouse, or friends, or with work, or with a certain disease, because there's still something of that distance. But the distance seems to shrink, between me and the client, between us and what we are talking about. And yeah, so we started to call that, to give it a different name, existential empathy, like the ability to be there at those very moments. And it's only a couple of weeks ago that I discovered that Gary Prouty was a student of Gendlin.
Yeah, I
Was
heard you
actually
say
already,
that.
yeah, was
Yeah.
actually already talking about, like, he was talking about existential empathy and the capacity to be there at those very moments, that you're just there as a human being with your client.
For
Yeah.
me, if it's a description of the kind of meeting we were just talking about, I would want to add another word to that
Good.
description. I would want to call it mutual existential empathy.
Yes. Yes.
Because for me, the experience is really, in that moment of meeting, it's like a larger space opens that includes the two of us and all of life.
Yes. All of life. I think that's true. It's not just the two of us, but it's all of life.
Yeah.
And again, what's fascinating about Otto Rank, sorry for making those jumps, but he's actually also talking about empathy and about the therapeutic relationship. But he says it's actually about those moments that we experience existence, that we experience, he says, das Ganze, the whole, that we are in the whole together. Yeah, the entirety of the life. Yes.
That he says that that's like
Yes.
a therapeutic kind of moment,
Yes.
or
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's the moment of, I don't know if the word change actually applies, but that's those moments that, I think also for clients and also for us as therapists, are very precious.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe it's the change that comes from that more radical kind of openness.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's also what Mick Cooper describes as a relation of that. That's probably also this describing the same moment, or other therapists or scholars have also been describing those moments, like moments of meeting, or
Yeah.
yeah.
It feels like it has a kind of, it leans into a more spiritual kind of experience. Would you say that, or?
Yes, I think so. What I actually find fascinating that is that Gendlin doesn't talk a lot about spirituality.
Yeah.
So, we started talking about the optimistic and the pessimistic, or the dark and the light. And I wonder, by not talking or not addressing death and meaninglessness, if that has a relationship with the fact that he doesn't address spirituality either, because they kind of go together.
Yeah. And you, from what you said previously, it sounds like your guess, which I think is probably at least partly right, is that he was just too concerned about imposing
Yes.
content on to people.
Yes, I think that's really that phenomenological stance of not wanting to impose concepts or expectations, maybe also, I don't know. Yes. And I think in one of his videos recorded by Nadalu, he also says, like, yeah, focusing is a portal, and it's not my mission to talk about what's behind the portal or behind that door. Yeah.
It's interesting for me, if the emphasis is on the positive, that it's meant somehow to be life affirming or very, very expansive or something. But for me, it seems like it's a lack of trust. If you have to always spin things towards the positive, it's not like that it's there, you have to actually spin it to be there. There's a lack of trust that what is real isn't somehow good enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or can't be lived with, or isn't itself life affirming, even if it's not what you want.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let me ask another question about.
No. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has something to do with trust, and with what Viktor Frankl calls basic trust.
Yeah.
It's like, but I find it actually difficult myself. Like, can I trust a process that does not only entail the positive,
Yes.
right? Or that has the capacity also for pain and destruction. And I find that
that's an interesting question. For me, I would say at this point in my life, I have reluctantly seemed to be coming to the point of view, which I still feel wary about, that the carrying forward can be trusted. It can be trusted to take me closer to a kind of a truthfulness.
Yes.
So truthfulness it becomes the value rather than positivity or something that feels good. It's actually, it believes it's better for me to face the truth. And that's where it's going to take me. And I can defend myself against that. I can try to avoid it. But if I give in to it, it can be a difficult reality. And yet, it, as I said before, it feels better to be there.
Yes. And also, it's saying yes to life, actually.
Yes, as it is.
As it is. Like, what is it? Amor fati, right?
Exactly.
So it's yeah. I really agree. And it's yeah.
And maybe it's, I was just thinking of the experiences of sitting across from someone who's focusing, and I'm either a therapist or a listener. And I'm thinking now that it's maybe a lot easier to trust the process that they're having than when I'm the one having the process.
Yeah. And at those existential moments, you're both, or we are both in that process, a larger living process, but really living process, which means that you don't know what will come.
Exactly.
Right? And we
Exactly.
don't know what will happen to the world, and we are, for me, that's kind of also life affirming. We are part of a huge cosmic something that expands, and we are on a planet that will, with a sun that will disappear at some point, but we are part of like a much larger system, and that runs through us.
Yes.
Right?
That, as Gendlin occasionally said, it's like it's living us.
It's living us, and we are expressions of that larger living process, which we hardly understand or can understand. And everything is part of it.
I find that very invigorating. Just the way you've said that, I really, really appreciate that. It makes me wonder how that fits with the broader culture of psychotherapy that's becoming more and more about sort of concrete treatments and manuals, and the larger culture that seems to become more and more about sort of certainty and conclusions
and polarizations.
Exactly.
Because it's also about like we, for one reason or another, it's like we have more and more difficulties towards the openness towards what you call truth, right, or reality, with all its different aspects and colors and shapes. Yes, I think in the therapy world, what is interesting is that also in CBT, I think there's actually more space for, that's at least what I experience here at the university, or also at other places. There is a curiosity towards the existential realm and towards the unknown, and a kind of the thought that maybe not everything can be measured, or like it's not that clear that therapy always leads to a positive outcome, because it's not. I mean, that's what we aim for, and it works at least as good as medicine, but also medicine doesn't always lead to a good outcome. We seem to forget that. Or surgery doesn't always lead to a good outcome. And I think there is a degree of growing openness towards the importance of the person of the therapist. There's a lot of studies being done about that. The importance of the person, of the therapist, of emotion regulation, in these kinds of terms. And also in some CBT circles, the fact that our people are searching for meaning and come to a therapist with that these days, right? Like, I don't know what to do with my life. Like, why are we here?
It's encouraging to think that maybe things are becoming a little more intermingled in the therapy world.
I think so.
That's
at least what I'm experiencing here. It doesn't mean that it's everywhere in the world, but there is like, maybe it has something to do with our times also that we are living in. With climate change and with all those things, like, it's hard not to see existential issues around us, they're just there. But maybe I'm just also after reading so much about it and studying it, it's to see it. So maybe I'm not a good example, but I think, also for other people, it's just there. When there's the forests are burning and you have floods and there's migration and we have like pandemic and who knows what is waiting for us.
And at the same time, rather than a kind of a solidarity amongst human beings, there's this strange polarization where you have to be in one tribe or another.
Yeah, that's easier, right? I mean, that's searching for certitudes, or that's like
Yes. Yeah.
maybe I wouldn't call it panic, but it's maybe we're all just searching for something to cling on. Like, yeah,
So how do we make uncertainty valuable to people?
yeah. What do you think? You make me
Um,
very uncertain. No, 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 no.
I
Yeah,
don't know. I think that if we begin to talk about uncertainty as an accomplishment rather than as a failure,
yes,
and if we can start to spread that point of view and combine it with this is my own pet project at the moment in my mind, not in reality. Combine it with teaching people how to listen. Because the listening process, as a listener, you have to make peace with not knowing. And you're following a process that the person you're listening to doesn't even know. And that kind of radical uncertainty and not knowing, it accomplishes so many things at once if we can open up to it. I think it brings people together. It's hard to feel the same about somebody that you've just listened to for 15 minutes who's in a deep process.
yes, and also it makes me think on about curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
because if you already know,
Yes.
there is nothing new happening. And I think curiosity, uncertainty, of course, it's not the same, but um,
It's an openness in some
it's
way.
an openness.
Yeah.
Yes. Kirk Snyder just wrote a book on life enhancing anxiety.
Mm.
So, yeah, how do we uh, help people to be curious, to
Mm-hmm.
be open, and to be with uncertainty? And I was just giving a class last week or this week, and I was talking about a client of mine, and we just had 2 sessions. So it's a therapy class with people who are in their masters of clinical psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I don't know what is happening in this therapy at this moment. She has those experiences somewhere over here, and we know that it has something right with uncertainty. She's talking about uncertainty, and I said, I don't know what uncertainty is about, and she doesn't know. What do you think? So they had like some hypothesis, and I said, okay, I will let you know further in the therapy. I don't know. And you see those students like, what? He doesn't know? What kind of therapy is this? Right? And I think this is like feeding into the curiosity, the
Yeah.
adventure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
the adventure, the not knowing, and it's a little bit unsettling because
Mm-hmm.
it's indeed not really how people think things
Mm-hmm.
work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or therapy works or other things work.
Yeah. You should know.
You should know. And I said to my students, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I will keep you informed what we find there or what we discover.
That
Yeah,
sounds great.
yeah.
I'm realizing we don't have a lot of time. I'm just curious what's next for you, or is there anything else is kind of brought up that you would like to mention?
I would like to thank you for, this talk. I really enjoyed it. And
Mm-hmm.
I also hope, I think maybe there's a hope to, I don't know, to incorporate, you know, uh, this uncertainty in focusing and in focusing oriented therapy, and with the whole community to debate or to discuss or to have dialogues,
Mm-hmm.
and to see also like how does this actually, how can it come together with Gendlin's process model?
Yeah.
Yes, and yeah,
Great. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. And when it's complete, I'll send it over and you can have a look, and then we'll decide if it goes up.
Good. Okay.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Have a
And
great
hope
day.
to see you soon in a different occasion or to
Yeah.
talk or whatever.
Me too. See you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.